In this series of videos, we're going to be learning about the structure of the nervous system and the various homeostatic processes that are used to regulate individual cells within the nervous system. If we start by describing the functions of the nervous system, we can come up with two general words that summarize the nervous system relatively accurately. That being control, making parts of the body do something, and regulation, making sure that the parts of the body are able to operate efficiently without being over or underworked. Now, the control and regulation exerted by the nervous system can generally fall into one of two categories, that being voluntary control and regulation or involuntary control and regulation. Now, voluntary control are any actions that we have full control over, meaning that we need to directly think about them in order to influence them from happening. Now, many examples of movement that we control, moving our arms and moving our legs, even moving our breathing muscles when doing very strenuous exercise, are examples of voluntary control. However, not all examples of voluntary control can actually involve muscular movement. All of the thoughts that you directly choose to think about are also examples of voluntary control. Now, with involuntary control, this is the opposite, where it refers to any action taken by the body where you don't directly need to think about it in order for it to happen. Probably the best example of this is heartbeat. If you needed to think about how fast your heart was beating in order to get your heart to beat, you probably wouldn't have the ability to think about anyone else, or anything else, rather. We can also lump involuntary breathing into this category as well. And yes, breathing is a little bit difficult to talk about because technically we do have some control over it, such as heavy breathing during exercise. But even as I'm speaking right now, I am also breathing and not thinking about this as I'm speaking. And that, for example, is what we call involuntary or tidal breathing. Now, if we take a look at the general structure of the nervous system, on the surface, it's actually relatively easy to understand the different parts, as there are only really two subdivisions of the nervous system, the more important of which, in terms of the regulation of the nervous system, is what we call the central nervous system, or simply the CNS for short. The central nervous system is made of the two most important parts of the nervous system, the first of which, and most important, obviously, is the brain, but also the connective nerves that are used to connect the brain to the rest of the body, and that, of course, is what we call the spinal cord. Now, all of the other nerves that are found throughout the body outside of the brain and outside of the spinal cord are what we call your peripheral nervous system, and again include all of the nerves, which are more correctly called neurons. Neuron is the scientific word for nervous system cells, and any neurons that are found outside of the brain or the spinal cord make up the peripheral nervous system, short form for which is what we call the PNS. Now that we have a basic outline of the structure, what exactly does your nervous system do? Well, most people have the understanding that your nervous system is fundamentally electrical in nature. So the way that your nervous system works is that it transmits signals that are electrochemical in nature from one nerve to another nerve, back and forth from the brain. And this electrochemical signaling that is transmitted is what we call action potential. We will explore what action potential is in its own series of videos. For now, what we can say is that although nervous system signals are electrical in nature, meaning that they rely on a transfer of positive and negative charge, the origin of that electrical signal is chemical, meaning that it comes from ions rather than from the flow of electrons as occurs in electrical devices. Now, even if we can't describe what action potential is, we can describe the general movements that happen throughout the nervous system. Now, all examples of action potential begin with something called a stimulus. In this case, the human eye, recognizing that there is a glass of water here, is an example of a stimulus. A stimulus is any environmental effect that can be recognized by the human body, specifically with the aid of organs that we call sensory organs. Now, this human here seeing the glass of water is obviously using their eyes as an example of a sensory organ, but obviously the ears for sound, the skin for touch, or even the tongue for taste are all examples of sensory organs. Now, in the case of the stimulus is not so much the glass of water specifically, but the light that reflects off the glass of water and enters the human eye in order to stimulate it, hence the term stimulus. And eventually, this stimulus is picked up by the neuron that is found at the back of the eye, which is what we call the optic nerve. And there's always an example of a nerve that connects from the sensory organ to the connection to the brain, which is, of course, the spinal cord. So the optic nerve is going to take the information about the stimulus and transfer it to the spinal cord, and eventually this is going to end up in the brain. Now, the job of the brain is to analyze all of the information about the different types of stimuli in the environment in order to come up with an appropriate response. So based on the information about the stimulus that was received by the eyes, the brain's going to consider all of those factors. How far away is the water? Does the water look clean? How thirsty is the person? In order to decide whether it's a good idea to pick up this glass of water or not. And when the brain decides on an appropriate response, that information is going to be sent back down the spinal cord and transferred through a nerve that is connected to something that we call an effector. Now, in this case, the effector happens to be the muscles that control the arm and the fingers, because the response that the brain decided is to pick up this glass of water and take a drink. But in the next series of videos, we're going to look at the different possibilities for what an effector is. Nevertheless, the job of an effector is to respond based on the response that the brain decided and to carry out the instructions in whatever way is possible. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the structure of individual nerve cells, followed by a more detailed look of the simplest form of a neural pathway, which is what we call a reflex arc.